morning. Good morning. It's good to be here on such a beautiful morning. Good to be here with you again for the second week as we look at some of the parables that Jesus taught. I find it kind of strange and perhaps a little bit sad that sometimes it seems like the most important issues in life are the ones that we think about the least. You know, sometimes we can spend a lot of time thinking about, like, what am I going to eat tonight for dinner? What am I going to do this weekend? What kind of vacation are we going to take this year? But sometimes the bigger issues in life, like the really big ones, things like, what is the meaning of life? What is a good life? How do we live a good life? Those are things that we often don't spend a lot of time deliberately thinking about. I think so often answers to those kind of questions come to us kind of just through our culture, through media especially, and especially through advertising. You know, of course, that's kind of like the purpose of advertising, is to kind of like convince you that, you know, if you use the right deodorant, your life will be spectacular. You know, if you want to, you know, be a success, you know, this is the kind of car that you should drive. You know, so all of those things, advertising in general, kind of tells us, like, this is what it means to have a good life. And again, we often don't really stop and think about that. You know, is this really true? Is my choice of deodorant that much of a life-changing decision? Is it going to really improve my life as much as they say it will? So again, I think we do need to think about this, and we need to think especially about what does Jesus have to say about this? So this week and next week, we're going to be looking at two different parables, which I think help us to kind of focus this a little bit, to kind of raise the question. This week, we'll be looking at a parable and at a passage that kind of tells us what life is not about, and things about what we should not do or how we should not be. And I think next week then we'll come and look at a different parable that will encourage us to think about what things should be like. So the parable that we're going to look at today is found in Luke chapter 12, and sometimes it's called the parable of the rich fool. It's the rich fool who builds, you know, two big barns, you know, to contain and hold all of his harvest. I'd like you just to direct your attention to the larger context of Luke 12, especially at the beginning of Luke 12, because in Luke 12, Jesus talks about several different things. And again, kind of tells us things not to be like. And this passage here is kind of like one of the last of those. So at the beginning of the chapter, in, you know, like the first 3 verses, you know, Jesus warns us not to become like the Pharisees and not to live a life of hypocrisy. In a sense, not to live kind of outwardly as if we're such good people, we're such pious people, and yet we have kind of like a secret private life that is kind of the opposite of that. You know, we want to look pious, but we spend our time perhaps judging other people and just finding fault and being critical and other types of things. Not really doing, again, the most important thing. And Jesus warns us that one day, on the day of judgment, all of those things that were done kind of in the dark in our private life, they will be made public. And so again, we have to think about that. From verses 4 through 12, Jesus talks about two different kind of things that, again, they have some similarity, but basically what he's telling us there is don't be fearful or anxious about our life. I think Jesus is looking toward a time when, his disciples, when believers in him, could very well face persecution. Sometimes perhaps on an official scale, the government could actually come and persecute you, or perhaps just more on a private scale, just among people you know. And so Jesus is warning us, don't fear people. Instead, we should fear God. We should fear what God has to say about us. And again, recognize that one day we will stand before him. And so what our true attitude toward him should be much more serious than it is toward what other people think about us. He also reminds us, though, that God does care for us. He knows us and he cares for us individually. He doesn't just leave us out there. And he tells us, don't fear standing up for your faith in front of people, in front of your friends. Again, they may mock you. And again, sometimes it may come to a point where you could be brought into court. Especially during that day, that was often the case in the early church. But again, Jesus tells people that God is with you. He will give you his Spirit, and God will help you to know what to say. And again, he's warning us that we have to think more about what God thinks of us than what people think about us. And so then finally in our passage, which is in Luke chapter 12, starting in verse 13, Jesus comes to a parable. Again, he tells us something we should not do or we should not be like. But just notice before we come to this that all of these things that he's talked about so far, there are things that look beyond just the present day. And Jesus is reminding us that one day we will stand before God and we have to answer to him. And so we need to have a larger perspective on things than just right now and just the immediate. And that's true, of course, in the parable that we will look at. So the problem here isn't just that the actions that Jesus has been talking about are, wrong actions, but the perspective that these people display is also a wrong, faulty perspective. Again, people are looking at their present circumstance only. They're looking at the now and perhaps even the near future. They're not looking at the distant future. They're not looking at the ultimate reality of things. They're also forgetting about God. And again, that's one thing that he's been trying to tell people, don't fear God, but don't fear people, but fear God. People can judge you, and, in cases like, especially in the early church, they could take your life. But the judgment that you may face later on before God is much more serious than that. And so he's reminding us that a life lived on a false perspective of reality can't truly be a good life. So let's look at this parable here. So Jesus is teaching his disciples, he's teaching the people, and apparently while he was teaching, this man stands up, and in verse 13 of Luke 12, he says, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." So he's calling Jesus, teacher or rabbi. And at that time, it was kind of common for rabbis to have kind of a role of informal role of kind of a judge. They could kind of pronounce, what is right or what is wrong in this circumstance. And so that's what Jesus wants, or that's what this man wants Jesus to do here. But notice that when Jesus responds to that, he's not responding by giving an announcement of, yes, you're right, or no, your brother is right. And in fact, this man isn't asking him really to make a decision. The man is asking Jesus to agree with me and be on my side and, give a sentence against my brother, a judgment against my brother. So Jesus doesn't do any of that. Instead of actually addressing the request of this man, Jesus is looking at a deeper problem that the question reveals. And that problem really is a problem of greed, of a desire for money, for riches, for possessions. So then Jesus addresses the real problem. And he says, take care and be on your guard against all covetousness. And this is an important statement here. For one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. So here Jesus is actually telling this man and his audience what the meaning of the parable is going to be, even before he gives the parable. This is the important principle to take away from this passage. And he illustrates this principle by giving this parable. So as we look at the parable, again, the story is a very simple one. We read that the land of a rich man produced plentifully. So this man, who was already wealthy, he had a very good year, very good harvest. Apparently everything worked out well, and all of his fields produced an abundance of crops. Notice here that the man didn't do anything wrong here. He's not robbing anybody, he's not stealing from anybody or anything. He simply just had a really good year. And he was fortunate in having a great harvest. But that great harvest then kind of produced a problem for him. He doesn't have anywhere to store all of this good stuff. He can't store all of the grain that his land has produced. And so he comes up with this plan. And he says, I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones. And there I will store all my grain and all my goods. And again, there is nothing necessarily wrong with this. Today that would be called probably a very good business plan. He's looking at the realities, the circumstances, and he's making plans to accommodate them. So he wants to, get his harvest in, and he wants to store it so that he will be able to keep it. He's being very responsible here. So it's good if we just pause here a sentence to realize that Jesus isn't telling this parable in a sense to criticize, in a sense, the notion or to teach the notion that wealth in itself is bad or that profits are bad. Again, nothing that this man has done so far has necessarily been wrong. The Bible actually teaches in different places, that people should be responsible. They should work hard. They should, take care of the produce, of their work. For example, we have, a verse or passage in Proverbs in Proverbs 6, where Solomon is writing, go to the ant, O sluggard, consider her ways and be wise, without having any chief, officer, or ruler. She prepares her bread in summer and gathers her food in harvest. So again, Proverbs kind of recommends that people do work hard, plan ahead, and be responsible. And Paul also, in his epistles in the New Testament, often, advises people, counsels people that they should work hard, they should provide for their families. And in fact, he criticizes those who don't work hard and who don't do that. And the Bible also talks about several people who were very wealthy and who were talked about in very positive ways. For example, Abraham. He was a very wealthy man of his age. King David also, gathered great wealth and was a wealthy man, and yet he was a man after God's own heart. His son Solomon also was one of the wealthiest men of his time. And again, that wasn't a problem. Solomon had other problems, but that didn't necessarily seem to be one of them. We come to the New Testament, we read in the Gospels about this man, Joseph of Arimathea, who was apparently a very wealthy man, and yet he was a very pious man. And basically the tomb that he had prepared for himself was then given for the use of Jesus. It was only, of course, he didn't know it at the time, it was only for temporary use, just for a weekend or so. But again, he used his wealth as, in a very responsible way. So what is the problem that this parable is talking about? Notice, if you look at the text, notice all of the statements in, verses, let's see, I think starting in verse 17. All the statements that start with, or that use the word I, like I myself. So the rich man talks about, what shall I do? I have nowhere to store my crops. I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones. There I will store my grain. And finally, I will say to my soul. And kind of accompanying these statements about what I will do are statements about mine, things that are mine. So he talks about my crops, my barns, my goods, my soul. And then we see kind of like the conclusion, the purpose of all of this for this wealthy man. He says, I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry. So again, everything so far in this has been focused only on him, his efforts, his plans, his profits, his wealth, his pleasure and enjoyment. And nobody else really comes into the picture at all. And again, in that time, people, especially landowners and people who, did raise crops, they were often, kind of commanded in the Old Testament that they should let poorer people come and kind of like harvest some of those crops, especially, kind of things that might have been missed or things around the edges. They're supposed to take care of the poor. They're supposed to do a lot of things. Again, none of that comes in here. Everything is about me and what belongs to me. So again, I'd like to pause here and just ask, how similar is this to what we hear around us today? Do we hear, again, if we look on media, if we listen to the advertisements, isn't what we're being told is that we should, relax, eat, drink, and be merry? And that's what success is really all about. If we can do those things, we've arrived, we've made it. This is what's important. This is what will bring us happiness. So this is, I think, very similar to what we hear from the media. But how similar is it to our perspective? How much of that do we just absorb for ourselves? Just kind of, again, unconsciously, because we often really don't stop and think about what should life be like and what truly is a good life. And again, if we don't think about those things, we will just accept the things that we hear around us. So in the next passage then, or next verse, God comes in and God appears here. And God said to him, "Fool, this night your soul is required of you. The things you have prepared, whose will they be?" So the sad part for the man, of course, is that he wasn't able to carry out any of his plans. Apparently, he didn't even get around to building these new barns or even perhaps harvesting his crops. Certainly didn't, get around to being able to live out, many years and relax, eat, drink, and be merry. That very evening, basically his soul was required. He died. So he wasn't able to enjoy any of these possessions. All of his dreams kind of just evaporated. And God calls him a fool here. And again, I think we need to understand what that means. It's not, a fool isn't somebody who's just kind of like a little bit stupid, maybe unintelligent. It's not somebody who just lacks common sense or experience. It's not that he didn't come up with a good business plan. Again, it's like he did, it seemed like what was reasonable to do. But in the Bible, especially if you look in the book of Proverbs, a fool is somebody who lives their life as if God doesn't exist. And so they live their life purely on their terms, on their values, their ideas, their goals, and they pretend that God has nothing to do with me. And that's a fool, because that is a wrong perspective. And at some point, they're going to realize that their whole life has been lived on this wrong perspective, and they are going to be held accountable for that. So the lesson, I think, again, for us is that, if somebody lives a life this way, again, during this life, again, not everybody dies before they get wealthy, certainly. But at some point, they will die and they will come before God. And a life that is lived in the wrong perspective is going to be a failed life, and they will have to answer for that. So Jesus' conclusion here is that so is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. And again, that's the problem of this rich fool. He was rich to himself, for himself, but he was not rich toward God. So again, Jesus is warning us, and he stated this principle at the beginning, that life does not consist, purely with one's possessions. Wealth and possessions have many different problems with them. At best, they are temporary, and we may not even live long enough to really enjoy them. We may spend our whole life working hard, investing well, and hoping that in retirement, we can finally enjoy what we would think is a good life, and we may not make it to retirement. Even if we do, those are a few years compared to eternity. Whatever enjoyment we get now is at best a temporary enjoyment. Another problem with possessions and a focus on pleasure is that pleasure does not really ultimately satisfy us. Have you ever had like a desire like, oh, I could really use a good ice cream sundae right now. That would just make me so happy. And you go and you eat that. And it's like, yeah, it was good, but it wasn't really as good as I thought. Tomorrow you want probably another one. And yeah, things that are pleasurable for the moment, but they're not ultimate. The pleasure doesn't last. Another problem with focusing on possessions is that there's never enough of them. If you ask somebody, especially like a very rich person, how much money is enough? What would the answer be? Probably a little bit more. And it's always that way. It's a little bit more. I remember reading this story once of a kind of very successful author, and he and a friend was going for lunch in the home of this very wealthy investment broker. And his friend asked him, well, how do you feel like, about this guy who can probably make more in a month that you would make from your writing in a year? And the author kind of replied, it's like, well, it doesn't really bother me because I have something that he will never have. And his friend's like, well, what is that? And the author replied, enough. And again, that's a very rare answer. But another problem with just focusing on possessions is that they're not really big enough to really provide a basis for the meaning of life or to guide us toward what is a really good life. Because we were made for something more than this. These things they can be very good, but they're not ultimate. We were made for something more than that. We were created by God, and we are created, in a sense, for God, and to live in this world kind of as God's representatives. We have been given a higher, bigger purpose that just a chase after possessions will never satisfy. I haven't really heard about this for a while. I don't know, maybe people still talk about it. But I know a couple decades ago, it was common to talk about something called a midlife crisis. Anybody ever hear about that? A midlife crisis was something where, usually some kind of like a successful career person, that they do everything that society has told them to do. They've, gotten all the degrees, they've gotten the great jobs, they moved up into, higher positions, they've gotten the bigger salaries, and yet they come to kind of like toward the end of their life, the second half of their life, and they realize that it really hasn't been all that satisfying. And so what do? They try to find something else that maybe will satisfy them, like buying a nice, fast, red convertible or something. or, doing something spectacular. But again, it shows that the things that we often chase after, they're not ultimate. C.S. Lewis had, I think, a great passage in one of his essays, The Weight of Glory. Sometimes we think that, if you're a Christian, we're not really supposed to indulge, or have pleasure. Having fun in things of this life kind of almost in itself seems to be a little bit sinful. We're supposed to always chase after spiritual things. But C.S. Lewis kind of puts a little bit of a different spin on that. He says the problem is that, as he says, our Lord finds our desires not too strong, but too weak. We are half-hearted creatures, fooling about with drink and sex and ambition, when infinite joy is offered us. Like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in a slum because he cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday at sea. We are far too easily pleased. And what he is encouraging us to do is to focus not on, again, the temporary, limited pleasures of this world, but to look beyond them toward the creator of this world and what we were meant to be. And I think this is the message of the Old Testament book of Ecclesiastes as well. There in that book, the author, again, King Solomon, who had the opportunity, the resources, the time to basically indulge in anything he wanted to do. And he found that there were many good things in life that can be enjoyed, but none of them were ultimate. That if you try to find ultimate meaning in anything in this life, basically it comes out down to what he calls a vanity of vanities and a chasing after the wind. It simply does not work. And he concludes the book by, again, coming back to that the thing we need to do is to look to God. That's where we're going to truly find our satisfaction. So Jesus' solution then, again, what he tells his readers or listeners here, is that we are not to become wealthy merely in terms of this world, but we are supposed to be rich toward God. So what does this mean? Again, we're going to talk about this next week, again, as we look at a different parable. But I think today we can note a few things that maybe can help us on that way to an answer. I think one of those answers is that we cannot live as fools in this world. We can't live as if God doesn't exist, and that life is supposed to be lived purely on our own desires, goals, ambitions, pleasure, whatever. We have to take into account that God has created us for a purpose. I think we can look back again at the beginning part of this chapter and kind of look at, again, some of the things that Jesus told us not to be like or not to do. And then, again, kind of like look, well, if those are the things that we shouldn't do, what are the opposites? What should we do? So instead of, rather than living life as a hypocrite, we should seek to live whole lives, that everything we do is directed toward something that is truly meaningful. We shouldn't try to live two different lives. We should try to live a life of integrity, of wholeness, and to live according to the truth. Again, we could say that instead of living life in a fearful way, afraid of what people will think or what people will do toward us, even, again, in terms of persecution. Again, we need to think about what really is true and to believe that God does know us, He cares for us, He will give us strength, He will give us His Spirit. And instead of trying to live in a selfish way, focusing just on our personal riches and our personal pleasure, we should seek to use those things in a responsible way, to enjoy the good things that God does provide, but to look beyond ourselves to a very needy world and to see what we can do to help others and to further God's mission. And finally, I think we need to see ourselves and seek to find and live out our true identity. We are creations of God. We are children of the King. We should live and think of ourselves as the child of the King. We are meant to look forward, not just to this life, but look forward to the future when God's kingdom does come, when His will is ultimately done, when His plan is accomplished. And we will live with our Father the King forever and ever. And in this way, we can all live happily ever after. So this next week, I would challenge you to think about, for yourself, for the church, what does it mean to live a life rich toward God? And how would that affect your life and your decisions? Thank you.